According to you, what is a real man, or what should he be?
You should want the best for people, for you, for your family, and for the community. Courage is a good thing. Courage in the face of life's difficulties. You know, one of the things I suggest to the people who are watching my videos, for example, is that a good ambition is to be the most reliable person at your father's funeral. The advice, maybe you could call it leadership advice, from the Sermon on the Mount is to keep your eye on the prize, right? So the first injunction is to love God with all your heart and all your soul. And so that's to lift your eyes up above the horizon and to focus on some transcendent goal, right? To maintain a relationship with what you regard as of the highest value or divine. And so that's the first thing, is to set your sights properly. And then the next thing is to concentrate on the day, right? Because the troubles of the day are sufficient. But what that does is gives you it orients you in two ways. It gives you real direction, but it also allows you to concentrate on what's right in front of you and perhaps to make the course corrections that are necessary that are associated with moment-to-moment transformation. And it's interesting that that particular sermon uses the day as the proper unit of measure, right? It's well, I know where I'm going, but now I have to figure out how I'm going to implement that in the here and now and make whatever course corrections are necessary. Women know what they have to do. Men have to figure out what they have to do. And if they have nothing worth living for, then they stay Peter Pan. And why the hell not? Because the alternative to valued responsibility is impulsive, low-class pleasure. And you saw that in the Pinocchio story, right? That's Pleasure Island. It's like, well, why lift the load if there's nothing in it for you? That's another thing that we're doing to men that's a very bad idea. And to boys. It's like, you're pathological and oppressive. It's like, fine then, why the hell am I going to play? If that's the situation, if I get no credit for bearing responsibility, you can bloody well be sure I'm not going to bear any. But then, you know, your life is useless and meaningless, and you're full of self-contempt and nihilism, and that's not good. And so that's why that's what I think's going on at a deeper level with regards to men needing this direction. A man has to decide that he's going to do something. He has to decide that. Women end up bearing the primary responsibility for extraordinarily dependent infants, and so they tend to look for men who can provide the resources to balance that out to some degree. So they're looking at productivity and generosity, let's say, as markers for a suitable mate. Now that's not the only thing, there's other elements that go into mate choice, but those are two very important things. And those are relevant and important. And so, well, what do you want to do? Well, you want to encourage young men to what? To grow the hell up, right? To take on responsibility. And so one of the things I talked to these young guys today about was where they'd found the meaning in their life. And they all said, well, it was a consequence of taking on more responsibility. The two young boxers, they were only 18. You know, one of them really talked about the fact that he had disciplined himself and that he wanted to go to college. He ended up wanting to go to college, and it was a boxing college, and there's like only 4 of them in the country, and he hadn't been doing so well academically, but he wanted to go to the damn boxing college because he had a talent and it was being encouraged by some older guys around him. You know, he was having some attention paid to him, so he buckled the hell down and did the best he'd ever done academically and got into the college. It's like, good work, man. Way to be. What would you call by the sophisticated integration of the emotions? It's like you're going to be facing hard things, man, in your life. It's like you're going to break down. And I mean, look, I'm saying this as a very emotional male, right? Like my proclivity to tears has been overwhelming all my life. And so
sometimes in your talks.
Yes. And so I'm saying that, knowing that about myself. What's wrong with the ability to endure? Like lots of times endurance is what you have. When things are really going badly, and they will, you have the ability to put one goddamn foot in front of the other. And maybe you're even manifesting negative emotion about it, but that doesn't mean you stop. You don't stop. And that's not just a cardinal element of masculinity, although it is in the symbolic sense. It's a cardinal aspect of the development of a forthright character. You want your children to be able to endure We're so naive. It's like, no, you want them to be happy. It's like, yeah, fine, but what about when they're not happy? What about when they have a sick child? What about when someone's dying? You know, like what? Well, they should be happy. It's like, God, it's thin gruel. It's a leaky boat. And so you train stalwart individuals to endure. Now, can that go too far? Well, obviously, you know, I mean, every culture can degenerate into cruel tyranny, you know, and they can engage in sadistic rituals that have this justification to train endurance. But what's wrong with endurance? And to inhibit emotion it's not to inhibit emotion precisely, it's to put things in their proper place. When you have people relying on you, including yourself, but when you have people relying on you, you don't get to quit. People die if you quit. They suffer if you quit. It's like,
if you're a parent, especially.
Yes, of course. And you know, and this is why I like the Christian metaphor, at least in part. It's like, pick up your bloody cross and walk up the hill. You know, and of course there's suffering and catastrophe associated with that. It doesn't mean that men should pretend that they don't have emotions, but you know, that's so obvious that it hardly needs to be discussed. And you're gonna have to be tough, not safe. Give up safe. What the hell? Safe, life, 100% fatal. There's no safety. The best you can do is to confront that courageously and to pursue something that's deeply meaningful, right? That's rule 7. Do what is meaningful and not what is expedient. You look for meaning in your life. You find that through responsibility. You put that up against the tragedy and the malevolence of existence, right? You grow up responsible and respectable and awake and wise, and you take your place in the world and you act as a cornerstone for your damn civilization. And that's what you encourage. And the lack of that, that's the crisis of masculinity. You need an adventure, and the greater the better. And so it's back to the high seas, gentlemen. You know, out on the rolling waves where there are new continents to conquer and new things to overcome. And if you think that all the frontiers are gone, then you're not looking, because there's frontiers everywhere, and that's where you should be, right? Working diligently to expand the domain of habitable order into the chaos of potential. And that'll force you to discover who you are and to bring that into the world. And that's the role of men in the 21st century. And there's nothing about that that's anything but good for anyone. I mean, one of the things that I detest about the current collectivist ideology and the insistence that what we live in is a patriarchal tyranny is that it associates the activity of stalwart men with nothing but tyranny and power. And I think that that's dreadful beyond imagining, because it conflates bravery and courage and competence and the desire to adopt responsibility and the ability to be generous with nothing but power. And it gives men, especially young men, an excuse to be useless so that they'll be harmless, so that they won't be destructive. And none of that's helpful. It's like you're a dangerous creature, and that's a good thing. And you should harness that and discipline it towards some impossible goal, one you can barely lift, and see if you can manage to struggle uphill with it. And then things will straighten themselves out. And then we won't have to ask, well, what's the role of men in the 21st century? There are terrible problems that need to be solved. Solve them. It's within our power to solve them. It's within your power to solve the problems that present themselves to you as your problems. Solve them. That's the right solution. And there's nothing in that isn't good. And there's nothing in it that isn't like that call to adventure that can get you up in the morning when it's a difficult morning, you know, when things have collapsed around you for one reason or another. You need a purpose for moving forward. And it has to be the sort of purpose that justifies the suffering. So that's that. Well, the first thing I think you need to understand is that these people that you're comparing yourself to, you don't really know very well. You know, and what that means is that you see their shiny outside, but you don't see the reality of their life. You know, maybe you're in California, see someone speeding down the road in in a convertible Porsche and you think, oh man, what a lucky bastard. And the truth of the matter is that he's thinking about wrapping his expensive sports car around the next cement pillar that he comes close to. You know, you can't tell, and people have hard lives, and even people who are comparatively fortunate have hard lives. And so the ideal that you're observing that makes you jealous and resentful is in large part an illusion that's created by your own mind. I can give you just one example. Is like I know a fair number of extremely wealthy people, and most of the people I happen to know are people who've made their money themselves. And I tell you, man, they have a burden of responsibility that would crush me, would crush the typical person. They're just working flat out, like 90 hours a week, and they have thousands of people depending on them. And you know, they have their money, and they have their status, and that's not nothing. But don't be thinking that there isn't a price to be paid for that. You know, they don't see their families, they're often divorced, they don't see their children grow up, and they don't have time off. Now, there are wealthy, what would you call, playboy types, I suppose, who live out the dreams of wealth of a foolish 14-year-old, but they're not that common, and you have to be careful of what you're jealous of because you don't really know what it is. And then the other thing that's kind of useful is to understand that you're different from everyone else. And this is especially true as you get older. When you're 17 or 16 or something like that, comparing yourself to other people makes a certain amount of sense because 16 and 17-year-olds, they're kind of the same, you know, which is why when you go off to university, you can make friends so quickly. It's like, I'm just about 60. It takes me like 15 years to make a friend now, you know, as opposed to the 2 months that it took when I was 17. You're quite different from other people, and you shouldn't be comparing yourself to them because they're not like you. You know, they don't have your family. They don't have your temperament. They don't have your troubles. They don't have your abilities. The only person that has those is you. And this is why one of the rules, I think it's rule 4, is compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. And see, that's a game you can win because you could be a little better today than you were yesterday. And that's a good thing. You're a little better. That's a good thing. And you know, no doubt there are some things that you could improve. You know, if you sit and meditate for any length of time about what you're not doing optimally, answers will spring to mind. You know, you could be getting up earlier. You could be watching YouTube less. Comparing yourself to who you are now, that's a game you can win.
So the C-suite types, they're working nonstop. Corporate lawyers in New York, you know, they make $700 an hour, but they work all the time. And there are people who are suited for that, but it isn't obvious that that's for everyone, or that it should be, or that it's even desirable. Now, it's a temperamental issue to a large degree. You know, many of those people are hyper-conscientious. And so if they'll work, wherever you put them, what they would do is work. That's who they are. And it's biological as well. It's not all biological because traits are affected by learning and by environment in complex ways. But a huge chunk of it is that you're born like that. And that has advantages and disadvantages. So conscientiousness is a good example. It's a good predictor of long-term life success. But people who are conscientious tend to tear themselves apart if they become unemployed, for example. You know, sometimes you get laid off. You worked hard, but you get laid off. Well, people who are conscientious will tear themselves into pieces with guilt in that situation because they tend to attribute so much responsibility to themselves. And so there's a price to be paid for conscientiousness. It opens you up to a certain set of vulnerabilities. So, you know, and you might be somewhat unbearable to your family too, because all you ever do is work. You know, you think, well, you want to be you want your father, maybe your husband, perhaps your wife, to be a good provider, but you want them to do that at the expense of everything else?
It's simple. If you want to be way out on the Pareto distribution, so you're in the top, say, 1% of performers, or even 1/10 of 1% of performers, what do you have to do? Well, first, having an IQ of like 145 or above, that's really helpful. Then you should be insanely industrious. So maybe you'll work 90 hours a week, or 100 hours a week, at nothing but your stupid occupation. And maybe you'll do that for like 50 years. And so if you do that, well, you're going to be in that top 1 in 1,000 category. There isn't much left there for the rest of your life. You're hyper-concentrating on a single thing. Now, why would men do that? Well, here's a hypothesis. One of the things that drives the probability that a woman will find a man attractive enough to sleep with is his status. So then you can think, well, that's an extra motivational boost for men. Now, whether that's conscious motivational boost or not is not the point. The question is it a boost that might have been instantiated as an evolutionary element of general motivation? Well, men are more competitive, they're more disagreeable, and if they're more disagreeable and more competitive, they seem to do better, especially in high status jobs, and then women are more likely to pick men like that for sexual partners, so it's at some point it becomes difficult to avoid the conclusion, especially since we know that the men on the way out on the tail end of the Pareto distribution are disproportionately likely to sleep with many women. So Warren Beatty, I think, 15,000, that was his estimate. 15,000 women. And Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the basketball player, he figured 10,000. So for every one guy who's got those numbers racked up, that's 10,000 guys who don't. So the male success distribution is extreme, and it's associated with outlier success in some important dimension of socioeconomic success. A handful of hyper-competitive men who are obsessed with hitting the pinnacle of the given dominance hierarchy they're in will happily work 80 hours a week, and they'll forego everything else. They're damn good at what they do, and part of that is they're smart and disciplined, and they'll work non-stop all the time. It's like an obsession, and that's the sort of people who run things. Those are the people who run things. It may be that unidimensionality is the price you have to pay to be exceptional at one thing.